Thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs today. I'm so glad that we've finally gotten a chance to connect.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Megan.
I am curious to know about your history in journalism in Canada. How long have you been at it? How did you get into journalism?
So about 20 years now. I started when I was out in Vancouver. The first about 6 years, I was writing about hip hop. So I started at the Georgia Straight. Eventually, I had an online column with Double XL, New York hip hop magazine. Eventually, I came out to Toronto. I worked in women's magazines for about 7 years as a writer and then an editor. And then I went to the CBC. Starting in about 2013, I worked at George Strombolopoulos Tonight on the last season of that show. And then I went into current affairs radio. And so I worked 2 stints in both Vancouver newsroom and in the Toronto newsroom. So twice in each newsroom, probably on about a dozen shows, all local current affairs radio shows, although I was also in the Doc Project. So I produced 2 documentaries for national shows. And then I also worked as like an on-air columnist, a books columnist in both Vancouver and Toronto, so contributing to different shows. That was sort of an occasional thing. And in current affairs, I did a lot of the roles in my newsroom. So I did show producer, show director, chase producer, night producer, morning producer. So like a really good sense of sort of the service as a whole in different regions. And when I left the CBC, I was on contract till December 2022 on a small regional show called Ontario Morning as a full-time current affairs radio producer.
So you've had a pretty successful career in Canada. I mean, Canada has a very small media landscape, and you've done quite well. Did you go to journalism school?
I did not, no. So I just started at the Georgia Straight. So what happened was, it's kind of a crazy story. I was at the Peak, the SFU student newspaper, and the first news story that I got assigned was a story about Disney and sweatshops. And the Hong Kong Christian Association had done an undercover sort of investigation into sweatshops and had produced this report, and no one was able to get a comment from Disney in Canada. And somehow in the Peak's like cavernous basement weird office in the middle of a long night of production, I was able to get through to the top corporate communications officer for Disney America. He gave me an interview, and then I took it to the Straight, and they published it and asked me would I like to start writing for them. And I very much would, of course. And I was then, hip hop is one of my passions, and I was doing a master's thesis on hip hop, if you can believe that. And so they put me in the music section, and I started doing reviews, and I started doing interviews and concert reviews, and it sort of went from there. And then really over the last 20 years, I've always also done freelance writing for a number of outlets, often on cultural issues. But really, like, I'm very much a current affairs journalist. I'm very much that mixed bag of, news and politics and arts and literature and all of those things. So
nice. I've always been into hip hop too, and I'm sort of jealous of your career path now. I wonder, like, having been in that world as like, covering hip hop and as a cultural critic, and just in general working in media in Canada, did you find that identity politics and conversations around diversity and inclusion and things like that were part of the conversation back when you were doing that kind of work at the Straight and at XXL, for example?
It's a really good question. It's really hard to know when identity politics really became sort of the main meal in media. I don't remember it being I just don't remember in the early years of my career it being such a dominant force. I think that there has always, certainly in hip hop, of course, there's always been conversations about racism. There's always been conversations about sexism and homophobia. And so there are different strands of that always going on. But I don't remember it being sort of the only conversation. And I also, the thing about hip hop that I think is super important to understand is that there's a very strong universalist feel to it as well. I mean, it comes from very specific set of historical circumstances, and yet there is this appeal always to the greater whole. And there are people who love hip hop like you and I, who come from very different backgrounds, and that the idea of hip hop was that everybody could come together under this umbrella with different experiences and could unite. And so there was a very strong sort of universalist feel to it that I don't see in identity politics today at all. So I don't know exactly at what point the identity politics became so strong. It's something I grapple with a lot in trying to understand, because there's parts of it I agree with and parts of it I'm interested in. The whole woke ideology is something that I think has some useful elements to it as well. I guess my biggest disagreement with it is it just being the only voice in the room. I think we need to look at all of the issues of our day, everything from news to culture, from many, many different perspectives. And my big concern is that we're just not doing that right now.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you also worked at the CBC for a long time. And I'm wondering if you ever experienced any form of censorship, or a time when you felt silenced, or you couldn't cover an issue that you wanted to cover, or you couldn't cover an issue in the way that you wanted to cover it.
So I think that the big thing to understand about how all of this works at the CBC, I mean, when I wrote my resignation letter from the CBC, I was really talking about 4 different things. I was talking about trends in coverage. I was giving some analysis of what I had seen in terms of the shifts and the balance of our coverage towards more identity politics stories, and making the observation that I didn't think that was what the public wanted. Which, interestingly, after my letter came out, I really heard, I mean, I got so much mail, and that really seemed to confirm that was certainly the case, that the public, at least those that I heard from, were really interested in a more balanced approach than what we were doing. I was also talking about top-down policies. And so things like the way that we booked guests. And so one of the things that I talked about was the race-based booking forms that we had in my newsroom, which actually, after the fact, Blacklock's reporter filed a Freedom of Information and received that and made that form public. And so I disagreed with that approach to booking, and I talked about that. I also was talking about a really stifling climate at the CBC, which was my experience there, that it was sort of an impossible situation for everyone, because there was so much fear of cancel culture, because there was so much groupthink that was, I think, a result of an over-reliance on Twitter, and perhaps even a lack of awareness of how reliant as a group of people we were on Twitter. And then also I was writing about and criticizing our COVID coverage, that I felt that, as a whole, we had been too credulous of government, of public health, and not critical enough in our coverage. And so those were the things that I really focused on. I wasn't making the argument that I had been silenced. I argued in news meetings, or in story meetings rather, every day for at least 2 years. So I did not feel silenced, but I felt like there were an incredible amount of pressures all converging on the newsroom that was making it really difficult for us to do our jobs properly, and that we needed to talk about those things and have a broad conversation about all of those different forces. And so there's lots of ways of approaching how that happens in a newsroom. And I think one of the helpful ways of understanding it is that sometimes that it can be not as overt as you would expect, that there are these kind of arguments happening in story meetings, that they're sometimes expressed through a total lack of interest in a story, whereas, sometimes expressed in a huge surge of interest in the stories that the identity politics kind of camp are most interested in doing. And so it's a constant negotiation. And I think my major point was that we were really lacking viewpoint diversity in our story meetings, that really it was a very kind of homogenous and stifling environment, and that we really needed to be introducing more perspectives, both on air and in the meetings ourselves.
And how much of that do you think is connected to the fact that it is Canada's public broadcaster, that the CBC is government funded? Particularly I'm thinking about, there's all sorts of issues that it seems like Canadians are not allowed to or not supposed to talk about because it doesn't toe the current party line. But in terms of things like COVID, for example, the way that CBC reporters are allowed to cover that issue, what they're allowed to speak about, what kind of columns get published, what kind of interviews get done, what kind of line is pushed, how much of that do you think has to do with the fact that the CBC is government funded?
So I take the position, I think that the CBC should be funded. I don't think it should be defunded. And that I believe the major issue here right now is that like a huge portion of the service all has the same perspective on everything, that we don't have that viewpoint diversity in the newsroom, that there's not, like, you really need, in order to have fair and balanced coverage, you really need a lot of different perspectives in the room and arguing and pitting bias against bias. And I didn't see enough of that going on. I think that's the major issue. I really think it's about encouraging a climate where people are able to argue and able to speak freely about their perspective.
Was there a point where you felt like things were getting really bad in that regard, or has it been like this all along in your experience at the CBC?
No, in my experience, it hasn't. I really think that for a lot of the time that I was there, this sort of woke perspective, I don't know what else to call it. I really don't know how else to talk about it. But as a shorthand, I think that a lot of the time that I was there, that was a voice in the room. And there were other voices in the room as well. But really, with the George Floyd protests and that huge reckoning that came from those, which in many ways I think was important, as well as COVID and the real extreme moment that we found ourselves in as a culture, I think that what happened is that a lot of those voices, alternative perspectives, either censored themselves, got crowded out, got convinced that it was not the right time to voice those opinions. And so I think it really has become more extreme in the last couple of years. And that was the thing that really was concerning to me. And I think where the rubber really hit the road for me was on the vaccine mandates. And I found that a really, really troubling story. There's a huge, huge public policy that has major impacts on people's lives, major impacts on people's livelihood. And I just didn't feel that was getting the public debate that it should get. And I was not happy with our coverage of that as an issue. I did not feel we were being as critical as we should have been. And so that was really the tipping point. And then another tipping point, and this is completely different story, was the Dave Chappelle story, which I did not cover on my show, but which, our big pop culture radio show had no perspective from comedians who love Dave Chappelle, from people who really value comedy and cutting edge comedy, for people who did not feel that special was transphobic. There was no alternate viewpoints in the one big segment on that. And I just felt it was very indicative of where we were at. And it was a personal one for me because I love Dave Chappelle so much, and because I love comedy so much, and because when I was working in the early days of the pandemic, which, as you can imagine, was very difficult. I mean, I'm a current affairs producer. I'm used to doing this huge grab bag of stories every day. And suddenly I'm just doing all COVID all the time for days and days and days. I mean, I think we counted at some point, I can't remember what it was, but something like 300 days in a row that had been the big main story. It was very stressful. I am not a science reporter. It was a very, very stressful time. And part of how I coped was to watch Chappelle specials. And it was, I just know so many people who did the same during the pandemic and who were able to get through because of that humor and that release. And so I think it was just a personal point for me of saying, like, something is not right. Like, this is not right. Something is just not right in how things are going here.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm curious to know if you were told that there was a specific way that you had to cover COVID and COVID-related issues like the vaccine mandates.
I don't think that it is. I don't think that's how it works most of the time. I certainly was not told you can't do this story or you have to do this. It was not how it works. It was about the tides in the newsroom and how many people all thought the same way about the issue, and how much sort of force that gathers across a whole service when you have a lot of people moving in the same direction on the same kind of story.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've heard criticisms of the CBC for several years now, with regard to COVID, with regard to issues surrounding woke politics and identity politics, with regards to coverage around gender identity ideology, with regard to issues like, Dave Chappelle and how cancel culture is covered, who's presented as good, who's presented as bad. And surely, I know that some of those people have contacted the CBC. I know people who've tried to call in on the CBC's call-in shows to share a different perspective that was not being shared, and they weren't allowed to get through to share their comment, which, I mean, of course, there's tons and tons of people who call in and don't actually get through. But when you're hearing the same viewpoint or a similar viewpoint over and over and over and over again for an hour, it's strange that no other viewpoint gets through. And I'm sure that it's not only just that one person that I know who's trying to call in and be like, well, what about these concerns? What about my concern around males being transferred to female prisons because they're identifying as transgender and how that might impact female prisoners? What about violence against women? What about women's shelters? I'm talking specifically about the trans issue, but this could be applicable to all sorts of various issues again. I mean, is that, were you hearing from people? Were you hearing were you hearing those kinds of criticisms? And was the CBC hearing those kinds of criticism? I'm just wondering how the CBC could be ignoring swaths of Canadians who are disagreeing and still deciding, no, this is what we're going to talk about and this is how we're going to talk about it, and we don't care what these people think.
Well, I certainly, I raised in the letter that I wrote, I certainly heard criticisms about a lack of viewpoint diversity. I heard that all the time. And in the last 2 years that I was there, I heard it frequently. And I raised a lot of those concerns in story meetings. So I know that I know that viewpoint diversity is an issue that I certainly saw firsthand, that I raised all the time, and that I heard from the public both before and after I left.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm always a bit baffled that for such a large, this is our largest media platform in Canada, and they're representing such a small minority of people. I know these aren't your decisions, so it's not like I'm questioning you on why you decided to do this, because obviously you did not, and obviously you left the CBC for these reasons. I guess, I mean, when you finally decided to leave, what was the response? What was the response to your resignation letter where you brought up your concerns and you made it clear that you decided to leave and you decided to go independent because of this lack of viewpoint diversity and because of this, I suppose you could call it like a culture of silencing?
Well, I mean, as you saw, it got a lot of discussion in this country. I honestly, when I wrote the letter and published it on Substack, a big part of me expected that it would be ignored in Canada because, as you know, the Canadian media, one of the ways that the Canadian media deals with controversial stories is just to ignore them completely. And I had written controversial things in the past, and that had been the pattern. And so a big part of me expected that would be the case here. So I was really, really surprised by by the response that it had, and very unprepared for that. And you've gone through sort of major viral events before. I have not. That was the first one that I went through, so it was quite instructive in a lot of levels, and surprising in some ways. And I think the thing that came out of it that was really, really useful to me was that I got so much mail from the public, and I continued to get so much mail from the public, and that I got so many emails from journalists across the country, inside the CBC and out, and that I really came to understand that the concerns that I was expressing were shared by a lot of people. And so it was helpful to know that and to see that. And it was instructive to see the way that, the sort of argument that I was making is that you can't say a lot of these things. and that was in some ways confirmed for me in terms of the backlash that I experienced as well. Although I don't feel, I think it's always important to say this, I don't feel at all like a victim. I said something controversial, and I'm a grown woman and can handle the criticisms that come from that. But the type of criticisms that came, there were so many ad hominem attacks and very little focus on the substance of the critique that I had made. And I thought that that was instructive. And I thought that some of the ways, some of the more some of the media dealt with my criticisms was instructive as well. That I had said that the ideology comes before the facts, and some of the stories that I saw were not overly concerned with the facts of the case. And so I thought that was interesting as well. But you've dealt with viral events before, you know how overwhelming that can be.
Yeah.
So it's really something that's taken a while to kind of get my head around.
Yeah. What were some of the things that were said to you, for example, on Twitter and in the media? What were some of the criticisms? What were some of the more harsh responses, and who did they come from?
I think there was one hit piece that made the claim that I didn't actually have a job to resign from at the CBC, which was a very bizarre. I mean, I was on contract till December 2022. It required me to write and submit an official resignation from that post. Anybody working in media in this country knows that a huge part of the CBC service is not permanent full-time. We're either on contract or we're casual working, getting our shifts 2-3 weeks at a time. So it was disingenuous in that respect, but also misleading because I very much did have a contract that had to be resigned from. So it was things like that, it's a very, making that type of claim is, it distracts the conversation away again from the substance of what I was putting forward in terms of my critique of our coverage and our trends in coverage. And, those trends in coverage, people could make arguments about, they could find data, they could do analysis. There's all kinds of ways of approaching rebutting a critique like that. But I don't think saying that, that I was not a permanent full-time employee, as many, many, many people in the service are not, has much bearing on the points that I was making.
No, and I feel like these types try to do this often. I've heard this happen to people before, where it's like, oh, she was on a contract, she didn't have a real job. Oh, she was fired, she didn't quit.
It's also, I'll point out, a very elitist argument to make too, isn't it? I mean, yeah. It's one of the things.
It wasn't even full time. Yeah, well,
I was full time, but it's a very elitist comment to make, and I know did not go over well with the casuals and the contract employees throughout the service, who already often feel like second-class citizens in that employment structure.
While you were still working at the CBC, and while you were thinking about these issues critically and probably thinking about potentially resigning, were you hearing similar critiques and commentary from your coworkers at the CBC?
So I guess I've made a commitment to not bring my coworkers into it. I made that commitment pretty early on, that I don't think it's fair to bring in other people to the conversation, particularly people who are precariously employed. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've talked to some other people who have had experiences at the CBC and left for various reasons, whether they were pushed out or fired or resigned. And I know that a big part of the problem with the Canadian media landscape, and that a big part of the reason why we're facing these issues around a lack of viewpoint diversity and this, toe the party line kind of thing, is that it's hard to find a media job in Canada, and it's hard to keep your job, and people are really, really scared. If they manage to get something, they don't feel that they have secure employment, and it's hard to make a living or a decent living as a journalist in general, but I think it's even harder in Canada because there's so few places to go.
I think that's such an excellent point. And I was asked sort of in the height of that media storm, like, what is one thing that the CBC could do right away to improve? And my answer was to hire all the casuals full time, because I don't know what the numbers are right now, but it's typically, when I was there, something like a quarter of the service across the country is not permanent, not full time. And so how that plays out in meetings, right, is if you have a story meeting and you have maybe 2 weeks of shifts and you don't know if you have work after that, and you're arguing about a story, how to cover that story, what guests to book for that story, what the questions should be on air, what approach maybe the host should take, who we research, who we talk to on background, all those kinds of questions. There should be spirited debates about that type of thing. There should be lots of discussion. But if you don't know past 2 weeks if you have work, and the very person who's in charge of saying to the scheduler, I want this person, the show producer is the one you need to win over in order to continue to get work, in order to pay your rent, are you going to be the thorn in that person's side? Are you going to fight for a different perspective, to fight for a different guest, to criticize the status quo, to say, I don't think we're being critical enough here, I think we're being overly credulous? Like, are you going to do that? I mean, how many people would do that? That's a terrible career decision, and it's a terrible financial decision.
Yeah.
And only lunatics like me would do that.
Yeah, only people who don't know how to keep their mouths shut.
Yeah. I'm not someone, and I think so many of us in this sort of heterodox space are the same. I cannot not say the thing. It's not in my nature. And we need at least one journalist in every story meeting who is like that. You need that perspective. It's a pain in the ass a lot of the time, but you need it.
Yeah, I've been asked the question a lot, like, how do you manage to say these things? Like, what's in you that like drives you to talk about these things. You know, what's like special about you that you can speak out about these things? And I'm like, I don't know, I just can't not do it.
Yes. Yes.
You really
Yeah, and I
can.
remember reading a Colin Wright essay way before all of this. Like, you know these sort of things build, right? And you know that there's turning points, and you know that there's points at which you go like, I'm probably going to say something at some point. And, you know, one of those moments was the Harper's letter. It was such an incredible, incredible relief to read that letter and to read so many writers that I respected going out on a limb like that and saying things are getting really stifling and that this is not healthy for open debate, for free speech, for democratic society. Another point was reading Barry Weiss's resignation from the Times, because I identified with her experience so much. And another point was the Colin Wright essay that I mentioned in Colette. And he said, you know, if you're looking for something in common of everyone who gets canceled, it's that they cannot just go along mumbling slogans. And I'm not able to do that. It's not something I can just do. But I have a question for you, because I know, you know, when I was in that viral storm, I don't think many people, you know, in the general public have experienced that. And you've experienced to a much, much greater degree than I have. What has that been like for you?
Well, at first it was incredibly stressful. And you do kind of get used to it. And I think I probably had a thick skin to begin with. I mean, just as evidenced by the fact that, you know, I've been attacked online since the get-go, since I started writing publicly. And I didn't stop. I didn't, you know, change my tune. I didn't stop saying what I thought. I didn't stop writing. I didn't go into hiding. I didn't apologize. But it does get easier, and I think you develop good boundaries around that kind of thing, and you learn how to not take it personally. The most difficult thing for me around those kinds of experiences, around, you know, mass attempts to cancel you or people kind of libeling you en masse, which that's the thing that really probably gets me almost the most, is when people are spreading actual lies about you. You know, I saw lies published about me in the Globe and Mail, and they wouldn't allow me the right to respond, which I thought was pretty crazy. But the worst thing is the personal impacts. Like, what strangers say about me on Twitter bothers me much less, especially now. I mean, I could hardly care what strangers say about me online. And there's so many things that people are saying that how could you possibly even keep track of them even if you wanted to? But you know, when you kind of lose friends or people behave as though you're making their life hard by speaking the truth as you see it, by speaking out about issues that you think are important, or just, you know, having conversations in a way that you're not supposed to have those conversations in progressive circles. And when people, you know, disinvite you from events or say, you know, like, sorry, I have to unfriend you on social media because my friend so-and-so doesn't like you. And I found that really hard. I mean, I left Vancouver in part because of that. Partly because I didn't like what was going on in Canada around things like the vaccine mandates and, you know, how Trudeau was behaving in response to the pandemic, the mandates, so on and so forth, and what seemed to be like a coming further crackdown on free speech. But also, I just, you know, I was really, really sick of the culture in Vancouver and this culture of fear that I saw amongst friends, many of whom would tell me privately that they agreed with me on all these issues that I was talking about, but wouldn't say so publicly. And it just seemed like for most people I knew, it was much more important for them to fit in and maintain their social status than anything else. And if that meant like discarding me publicly, then that's what they were willing to do. And that's not the kind of person that I am. And I don't respect that. And it's not like that everywhere. I think people don't realize when they're part of those social circles and that culture that everywhere in the world is not obsessed with woke politics and
No.
with fitting in that way and with saying politically correct things.
No, it's actually a very, very unpopular set of ideas. And I just packaged a podcast today, actually, that'll be out next week. And this is one of the things that the guest was talking about, is that these are elite politics. They are elite politics. And there's a real lack of awareness of how unpopular they are with the general public. And, in some cases, I think they're just totally off the radar of the general public. But also, when they're not, they're not popular. They're not popular ideas. And that the sort of rarefied world of Twitter is just, it's not the public square. It's not.
No. I mean, I'm curious to know, we were meant to talk, I think, about a month ago, and we had to move the interview for technical issues. Sorry about that. But one of the things that I had wanted to talk to you was the attack on Salman Rushdie.
Yes.
And I wonder, I mean, I'm not really in these circles and I'm not on Twitter, so I didn't see everything that went down, but I'm curious to know what kind of response you saw from Canadians in media and in groups like CanLit, like in these kind of progressive groups with, loud voices on Twitter, maybe not loud voices elsewhere, but certainly loud voices on Twitter, who have really led the charge. CanLit, for those who don't know what that is, that's Canadian literature. So people in that world, ironically, have worked very hard to cancel all sorts of people in Canada for saying the wrong thing. And there's been quite, bitter fallouts in the publishing world and in CanLit and the media world and in progressive circles in Canada on account of those cancellations. I mean, what was the response that you saw to that attack on Salman Rushdie and the connection to free speech and censorship, which obviously he as an author has faced in mass, really harsh, dangerous proportions?
Yeah. Such a good question. I mean, I saw a huge sort of outpouring of support for Salman Rushdie, and I saw a real horror and a beginning of an articulation in favor of free speech, which was very heartening to me, because it seemed to me especially in the year running up to it, that that value and belief had completely fallen out of favor. And I was seeing people cast that as a right-wing value. And so I was heartened by that, but I was also very aware of the dynamic that you're referencing, which is that, and I wrote about this, that I would like to see more authors speaking up for free speech in general. Before this, it would have been nice to see authors speaking up more. I don't find CanLit particularly brave at this point in time. And I think it is so self-destructive and counterproductive, because, writers, thinkers, journalists, all of us, we do not exist without free speech. We do not exist. Like, we don't have jobs. Beyond that, we don't have social roles without free speech. And so the position that has been taken on that in Canada has been horrifying to me, and is something I've written about a lot. That I think we are behind right now in Canada. I don't know what you feel like in Mexico, but like the conversations that I have in the States, it does feel like the tide is turning a little bit now. And it feels like you're starting to be able to say things in a much more expansive way all over the board. I mean, part of it is that a lot of information is coming out too. A lot of the COVID stories, we're getting a lot more information now, and we're starting to see the incredible consequences of the stifling of dissent. And so I hope that that's a transferable lesson for all of us. And but I do feel we're behind in Canada. I don't feel we've had enough people speaking out. I don't feel that the journalists and the writers have done a lot on that issue in this country right now. And I understand why, because the stakes are incredibly high, as you and I have both discovered. Like there are consequences to this stuff. And, for people who have mortgages, I do not have a mortgage, like I do not have children.
I don't have much to lose, for better or for worse.
Yeah, right. So the consequences for people are extreme, and some people are better suited to deal with being criticized on the scale publicly that you have to be okay with to talk about these things right now. So I understand why people don't, but I can't help but still say that I wish they would, because it is a completely different scenario if one or two people are talking about this, or 5 or 10, than if every writers group and every literary festival and every literary journal and every cocktail party at a literary event, if this is an actual issue on the table that people are getting into. That's a totally different scenario.
Yeah, I do think that the tide is turning in the US. I think a lot more people are pushing back, and it's becoming easier and more common for people to push back, and therefore harder to cancel people who do push back. And the only place where I've really seen that happening in Canada is with the Freedom Convoy, the truckers convoy, and pushback against Trudeau's mandates and what he's said about, the really pretty horrible things that he said about Canadian citizens who don't agree with his policies. I guess I wonder what you think about Trudeau's response to free speech. I mean, he's tried to put forward a couple of bills to crack down on so-called online hate speech, and hate speech in Canada in general, and his behavior to the truckers and to the Freedom Convoy was really abhorrent. I mean, the freezing of people's bank accounts, the libeling people as misogynists and racists, because they were participating in these protests. I mean, do you see, you're still living in Canada, do you still see a lot of support for what he's saying, for his policies, for his approach to free speech? And are you concerned about the future of free speech in Canada?
Yes, I am very concerned about the future of free speech in Canada. Extremely concerned. And to speak to Trudeau's comments, to label dissenting opinion as misogynists and racists, and that was, to my mind, an incredibly, incredibly destructive thing to do. And I see the ripple effects of that all the time right now. So I get mail from people who have either chosen not to be vaccinated or who have been vaccinated but are deeply, deeply disturbed about the climate here and about the divisions. And I also hear pretty regularly from people who harbor a lot of animosity for people who have chosen not to be vaccinated. And this is something like I have never experienced in my lifetime in Canada before. I have never experienced this level of division ever before. And certainly as a journalist, I have never seen it. So I find it extremely, extremely, extremely concerning. And I also think, there was quite a powerful moment during that crisis in Ottawa in which Joelle Lightbound, the Liberal MP, broke ranks with the Liberals and came out and said, this has been used as a wedge issue. This has been used for politics. And the idea that the country's unity, that the ability for neighbor to get along with neighbor, for people to work together in harmony, that would be sacrificed to politics is really, really upsetting to me. And in terms of free speech, so I have been covering some of those bills, and I had Michael Geist, Ottawa law professor, on the podcast, who follows that incredibly closely, who has his own podcast. And what I see there is quite disturbing as well, from an institutional, like legislative perspective. There was one, I can't remember which bill it was. I can't remember if it was C11, but I listened to that bill being rushed through. And I listened to the fact that they weren't even reading, like they wouldn't even articulate what parts, amendments to the bill were being voted on. Like it was being rushed through. That seems very, very anti-democratic to me. So I'm very, very concerned. I'm concerned at all levels of our society. And that's part of why I write about this issue all the time. And part of why I would really like to see more people writing about this issue, because I really do think it's the fundamental kind of the fundamentals of our country depend on free speech. Well, I will say what I think is really interesting, again, in terms of the response to all of this, and I'm watching sort of the Conservative Party quite closely right now, because you are seeing this huge wave of interest in Pierre Poilievre. Tons and tons of new members signing up to that party. And then he just won the leadership of that party in an absolute landslide. And so, you know, I don't know a ton about him. I don't know a ton about his policies yet. I'm watching him very closely, but I think that's a really, really interesting response to what we all have been watching over the last couple of months. And I'm really interested to see what happens with that.
Yeah, I mean, it might be the first time I ever vote Conservative.
I mean, we're both leftists, right? We're both from the left, right? But I also think that this is that those categories are being completely scrambled right now, anyways.
Yeah. I know you have to get going pretty soon. I'm wondering what your experience has been like going independent. Are you happier? Are you busier? Are you poorer? You know, how's that gone for you after having worked, you know, for other organizations and publications and for so long, for other media platforms for so long? Now you're working for yourself. You don't have a boss anymore.
I'm very fortunate that it's gone quite well. So I'm certainly able to support myself very comfortably, which is wonderful. I'm not rich by any stretch, but I'm fine, which is amazing. And it was, of course, a huge financial gamble to do what I did. So I'm very lucky in that respect. I do work all the time, as does anyone. You know, anyone independent knows this.
You don't really ever stop working.
But I love it. And it is so, I just can't describe the satisfaction that I feel to be able to follow my curiosity, to be able to do the stories that really matter to me, to be able to book the guests that I want to book, and to talk to anyone across the ideological spectrum. That is incredibly, incredibly satisfying and rewarding. And I'm really, really happy with that. And I also think I recently had Konstantin Kissinen on the program. And one of the things he talked about that really stuck with me is, you know, Trigonometry, their podcast. He was talking about how in the beginning they had existed in the comedy world for a certain amount of time, and that coming out of that world, there's a process of coming out, right? Like, because you had been so used to, even someone like me who argues all the time, I was still so used to thinking so carefully about what I said and choosing my words so carefully and thinking all the time about the consequences of what I was going to say or had said or might say. And to leave that behind, it's so different. It's just so different. And it does take a while to adjust to it and to be able to, like one of the things Constantine Kissin was saying is he's just always at an advantage because he's not thinking or strategizing or trying to figure out the right way to say it, or he's just saying what he thinks, which of course audiences, I think, are craving that for sure. But I am more and more and more just saying what I think. And I find it so liberating and so freeing. And as you know, once you've broken ranks, it's done. And so you do have the freedom to say the things that other people maybe are not able to say at a certain point in time. And so I never take that for granted. I always appreciate that. And that's part of what I am striving to continually reinforce in the public, is that we all have that ability, and that the more people do it, the more we all have that ability without these bizarre and crazy online consequences that one has to deal with in other scenarios. So, I mean, I at some point we'll have to talk again about feminism, because that's another whole conversation that I really want to have with you. But
yeah, totally.
It's been so freeing too, is just following my interests, that I can cover COVID policy one day and the next day talk about this incredibly huge crisis we're in between men and women right now. And I just, it's very, very satisfying, and it's worth the hard work, and it's worth it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I'd love to have another conversation with you about feminism. That would probably take an hour in and of itself. Can I ask you one more question? Do you have time?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so you interviewed a lot of rappers. You worked in hip hop for a long time. Who was your favorite interview, and who was your worst interview?
My favorite interview and my worst interview are the same interview. It is Kanye West.
Oh, wow. Kanye West.
So
that's not surprising, I suppose.
Pardon?
That's not surprising, I suppose.
It was for a cover story for The Straight. It was on my birthday. It was, 15 or 16 years ago. And he was impossible, and also incredibly dynamic and interesting and all of those things. Like just Kanye, of course, Kanye. But it was a tough interview to do, because I had to be really tough. I had to really push back. And he was hilarious about it. And at one point I said in the interview, like, okay, Kanye, that's it. I'm not asking you any more questions. I'm done. And he said, well, I'm not getting off the phone. So we ended up having this really, really interesting conversation. And we, one of the things he talked about, which I thought was so fascinating, was we had talked about Katrina and about when he came out after Katrina and said that very controversial thing. And but he said actually around the same time he came out.
This is the Bush doesn't care about Black people.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Around the same time, he had also come out and talked about homophobia in hip hop, which was incredibly taboo at that time, incredibly taboo, and has since changed a lot, actually. Like hip hop has really, really changed. And so he said basically that it was harder to say to hip hop that we have to stop being so homophobic than it was to say to America that Bush doesn't care about Black people. And I found that just so fascinating. So that was the hardest and the worst and the best all at once. And it also was a really valuable lesson. Like hip hop really toughened me up. And I'm so grateful to it. I went into hip hop. I'm Canadian. I'm often overly nice. Like, I'm a woman, all of those things. And those rappers, like, they toughened me up. And those are lessons that I have taken forward for my career for the rest of my life. Like, I love hip hop, and I love what hip hop did for me, even though it was really, really tough. And this is something else that I think about a lot, right? Is that resilience. Like, that resilience. And it was sometimes hard to be a woman in hip hop, but it was worth it. And it was hard sometimes to push back, but it was worth it. And it was hard sometimes when they pushed me in interviews, and it was worth it. I mean, this is the deal. Like, this is the deal. I don't want a completely safe life. I want to be dealing with the difficult aspects of life.
Yeah. And I mean, that should be true of journalism in general. And I'm not sure if that's any longer the expectation for young journalists who are just entering the profession. But it should be hard. It should be hard and scary, and it should really toughen you up. And you should be dealing with difficult people and having difficult interviews.
Well, this is a thing that I don't think we talk about enough in journalism, is that this is an adversarial role. Like, this is fundamentally an adversarial role. And journalism used to be a working class profession, and it has become an elite profession, even in Canada. I mean, we don't hire from the Ivy Leagues the way that the Americans do, but it is still an elite profession in this country. And it is not, it is less and less about sort of afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. It is less and less about that. And I really think we need to go more in that direction. I think we need to be more comfortable with being adversarial and with understanding that, our job is to push, to try to get the truth, and to push. That is the job. It's to push. And it's a different world right now in journalism.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm so glad that we had the chance to talk. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that we get the chance to talk again sometime soon.
Absolutely. We'll talk about feminism at some point in the future. Thanks so much for having me, Megan.
Definitely. Okay, take care. Bye.